Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked on Wolves. Today on the show, some morning after thoughts. Well, I guess 6 hours after thoughts from the Timberwolves opening night win against the Oklahoma City Thunder. A quick preview of Wolves Jazz on Friday night as we see some old friends back at Target Center and Rudy Gobert faces his former team. Plus, Zach Lowe's article citing Anthony Edwards as one of the X factors in the league this season. We'll cover all that on the show here today. Welcome in. You are Locked on Wolves.
You are Locked on Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked on Wolves podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Beecken. I'm the host of Locked on Wolves. Today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. Happy Friday, everybody. Happy weekend. And happy Timberwolves game day. The Timberwolves take on the Utah Jazz this evening at 7 p.m. Central at Target Center. It's the second game of the season. Both Utah and the Timberwolves are 1-0, so we'll preview that here in a little bit. Utah's a surprising 1-0. We'll talk about their roster, what to expect, among other things here today. First of all, though, a big thank you for making Locked on Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, you can find Locked on Wolves free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms, wherever you get podcasts. You can also follow on Twitter at Locked on T-Wolves and also at Beecken, and that's with two B's, two E's, C-K-E-N. I should mention that Locked on Wolves, along with all the other Minnesota podcasts at Locked on Minnesota, are available on Roku and the Amazon Fire TV device as part of Locked on Sports Minnesota. We have our own app. It's more great local sports coverage 24/7. It's absolutely free. Be sure to download the Locked on Sports Minnesota app today on either Roku or Amazon Fire TV. All right. So a lot to get to today. I want to start with some basically day removed, I guess really when I'm recording this, 24 hours removed, kind of day after thoughts from the Wolves season opening win over the Thunder on Wednesday. I want to get to Zach Lowe's comments and Anthony Edwards potentially being one of the league's biggest X factors this season. And then we'll close with the Wolves Jazz preview. A quick programming note, following the game on tonight, on Friday, we'll have a live postcast with Marnie Gellner from Bally Sports North, like we did on Wednesday. We'll do this. Most of the time will be about 45 minutes following the game after she does the post-game, et cetera, on Bally. We will not do a full post-game pod. It'll just be the 10, 12 minute or so live postcast with Marnie. So if the game ends around 9:30, look for it around, give or take 10:15 or something like that Central. And then, of course, that'll come up. The audio will be up on this feed, Locked on Wolves, on all the audio platforms, wherever you're listening to this podcast. If you're on YouTube, the live show will post and then publish, the archive will publish on Locked on Sports Minnesota. So not the Locked on Wolves YouTube channel, but the Locked on Sports Minnesota channel. So be sure to check that out following the game tonight. Some final thoughts on Wolves Thunder from Wednesday after kind of sleeping on this, taking the day to think about it, kind of rehashing some of what happened on Wednesday. A couple of thoughts on the concerns side, and I say this in air quotes if you're not watching on YouTube because it's one game, but we can still have concerns based on one game, right? Things that didn't go well. What does this mean moving forward? And then just kind of another general thought. Number one, the defensive issues I thought were the fact that the Thunder are the Thunder and don't have really any, I shouldn't say really any, they have very few NBA caliber jump shooters. That saved the Wolves on Wednesday. I said following the loss to Brooklyn, the final preseason game last Friday, a week ago, I said, hey, if the Wolves play like they did against the Nets, they'll win against the Thunder next week. They'll probably beat the Jazz. They'll probably beat San Antonio, who they play here soon. And in some ways, they were better. I think they were better offensively, certainly for most of the game against the Thunder than they had been against Brooklyn, but they were worse defensively. Against Brooklyn, I thought they were better defensively. It's just Kyrie and KD are Kyrie and KD and did what they do. But the Thunder were awful offensively and the Wolves were bad defensively, and it just worked out because the Wolves did enough on offense and it was, the Thunder. But there was an interesting stat that was actually pointed out by, I had to credit Jace Frederick, for pointing this out on Twitter. Of course, Jace covers the Wolves for the Pioneer Press in St. Paul. He tweeted out this stat from NBA.com. The Timberwolves gave up 47 shots that were classified as, quote, wide open, according to NBA.stats.com or stats.nba.com. The next highest across the entire league, and virtually the whole league played on Wednesday, was 27. They gave up nearly twice as many wide open shots as the next worst number, the next worst team in that regard. That's horrendous. They dodged a lot of bullets because it was the Thunder. And this is something we're going to see throughout the season, because teams that want to play small are we'll get to rebounding here in a second, because that I think is related, weirdly enough. But teams that are going to try and play small against the Wolves, and the Thunder didn't have much of an option, right? With their roster, who's available to them, they kind of always are going to play small, but teams are going to try to play small and get up shots on the perimeter and try and force Rudy and Cat out of the paint to go out and guard on the perimeter, and therefore open up, driving lanes, possibilities for offensive rebounds, because there's just this vacuum where the ball kind of bounces. We saw this happen multiple times. The rebounds just came down in the paint and everybody was on the perimeter. So it was just a mad rush to the ball, and the Wolves guards didn't rebound well enough. The Thunder as a team did. They have enough length, even if they didn't have size. They had enough length and athleticism and youth and tenacity. The two-way guy for the Thunder that had a great name, whose name is escaping me. They played hard, especially in that third quarter, and sucked up a lot of those loose balls, those rebounds. But they also missed a ton of open shots, and the Wolves dodged, well, I guess not 47 bullets, because some were made, but a huge chunk of those 47 wide open shots they dodged. The Wolves did. And like that may work against Utah. I mean, Utah's got more shooters than the Thunder do. Utah, actually, we'll talk about this later in the show. They've got some offensive talent. I know that everyone's preparing for a tank there, and eventually I think we'll get there. But it's not all bad in terms of offensive talent. Ever heard of Malik Beasley? He's a career 40 plus 41% 3-point shooter, right? They've got Jordan Clarkson. They've got others who have offensive talent, and you can't give up 47 wide open shots to any NBA team. And again, we're very fortunate to win despite that on Wednesday against the Thunder. My next thought is related to rebounding. I already covered it a little bit, but that's a lot of the issue, right? Is opposing teams are going to try and suck Rudy and Towns away from the paint by playing 5 out, and then it's a matter of who can get to these loose balls. Now, Ant was okay. He had, I think, 8 boards on Wednesday, which I said this post-game, that's abnormal for him to get that many rebounds. Teams are going to try, and Ant has to do that. He has to play that role. Jaden McDaniels has to grab rebounds. D'Angelo Russell has to rebound his position, because if teams that are able to play small or don't have any choice but to play small, and they play hard or are well coached, can exploit some of those weaknesses with the Wolves. And I'm afraid we're going to see some of that this year, those kind of mid-range rebounds or the long rebounds, because teams are shooting a ton of threes, which leads to longer rebounds, which leads to higher variance in who's grabbing these rebounds, right? It's essentially just like, I don't know, I think of what's the board? Trouble? Is Trouble the board game where you put the dice in the thing and you pop it and the dice just kind of pop in the air? That's what those rebounds are like, is it's essentially like a jump ball, and it's whoever gets it, gets it. And the Wolves didn't show much desire to dive on the floor for loose balls. Certainly not like the Thunder did in the season opener. So that'll be something to keep an eye on, because I'm guilty of this, just kind of saying, well, of course the Wolves will be a great defensive rebounding team. They have the league's best defensive rebounder in Gobert. Cat's been good throughout his career in that category, and now the Wolves don't have to rely on him for that. We'll see. I mean, some of these teams, and I think the Thunder are well coached and play hard, they just don't have enough talent. Utah, it's unclear at this point, but some of these other teams that they play, San Antonio is going to be a well-coached team. Will they play hard? They're in a similar situation to the Thunder in terms of talent, or even less talent, I would say, on their roster. But it's really going to depend on the opponent, unless the Wolves figure out a counter to this. My last thing is that this Timberwolves team does feel like a team, and I realize I'm basing this off of one game, but I'm going to throw it out there. It feels like the Wolves often this season, there's a chance that they'll start really well offensively. And because Finch will have all these play calls in place, like a little bit like an NFL team that scripts their first 15 plays or whatever. Finch is going to say, all right, here's our first set. Here's what I want to get into in the first quarter. Here's what I want Rudy and Cat to run. Here's what I want D'Lo to get us into. And then as the game goes on and there's more transition opportunities and, rotations get played around with and different guys are in the game and you have starters mixed with reserves and I think things could very well have a tendency to devolve into whatever happened in the third quarter, which was D'Lo and Anthony Edwards essentially taking turns in ISO ball and then suddenly pick and roll at the end of end of the shot clock. And D'Lo that's one of his weaknesses as a point guard is he allows things to kind of devolve. Is probably the best way to say it. And Finch tried to go with Jordan McLaughlin to kind of steady things. That didn't work. Jalen Noel couldn't steady things, and it was just kind of this massive 19-5 run that the Wolves couldn't do anything about. I'm really curious to see if over the course of the season, Chris Finch is willing to do more than I know he likes to talk about putting up bumpers or guardrails and guiding the team within them. And can they figure it out within, which I generally think is a great philosophy. These guys are professionals. It's not a high school team. They should know how to get themselves into sets. They should know how to get themselves open shots, the shot selection stuff. They should generally know what they're doing, right? And they do, of course. But does Finch need to be a bit more hands-on, especially early in the season? Even though it's not a super young team outside of McDaniels and Anthony Edwards, right? You're talking about some real veterans, and especially Rudy, but Cat and D'Lo, Kyle Anderson, and these rotation guys all have some experience at this point. But does Finch need to be a little more hands-on in terms of in-game timeouts? We saw that as an issue in the playoffs. Occasionally, Finch was holding on to those timeouts and waiting for the tide to be stemmed, and it just wasn't. And maybe it's different with Rudy Gobert because he can get the block shot, or he can get the rebound, or he can get the putback dunk that maybe they couldn't get before to end an opponent's run. But Finch may just need to be a little more hands-on early in the season with this particular team, rather than just the guardrails, rather than just the bumpers that he likes to talk about. Will he be willing to guide the team in game as needed? Now, who knows? I mean, this was the Thunder, right? I think everybody felt the Wolves could pull it out, but can they break some of these bad habits? Can they, can they get past some of these in-game, the devolving offensively and the lackadaisical defense like we saw in the third quarter? Or will Finch need to step in and be a little more hands-on? I think that'll be something really interesting to keep an eye on this season. And so that's something we'll definitely keep coming back to for sure on the show. All right, let's talk about the Zach Lowe ESPN piece about X Factors, which involves one Anthony Edwards in a pretty big way. First, though, let's talk about our friends, the title sponsors of this show today, and that is BetOnline. BetOnline.net is your number one source for betting football and the start of the new basketball season. Find all the latest player developments, team matchups, news, podcasts, and in-depth analysis at every single game. Thursday is a great night to be on BetOnline, by the way. You have, of course, Thursday Night Football on Amazon. You've got the two national basketball, the two TNT games. I think there are only two games this week, but some weeks there's 2 or 3 NBA games. You got playoff baseball. Thursday is one of my favorite nights because there's just kind of very few games, but in multiple sports. And so you can get involved across the board. It's a ton of fun. As always, BetOnline remains your continued source for all your sport wagering information with live betting and up-to-the-minute scores for every sport out there. It's the fastest and easiest way to check in on all your games and events. That includes MLB with the playoffs, of course, football, basketball, NHL starting, MMA, boxing, golf, and beyond. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more. BetOnline, where the game starts. Thanks again for making Locked On Wolves your first listen today. Now, make your second listen the Game to Game NBA podcast. Every moment, every top performance, and every result. Locked On Game to Game covers every game from across the NBA with local analysis that only Locked On can deliver. It's essentially 60-second summaries of every game from each of our hosts, yours truly included, on nights the Wolves play. It's the best way to get caught up. Follow Game to Game on Locked On NBA. It's available on the Odyssey app. It's available on YouTube, and it's also available wherever you listen to podcasts. So go check that out. All right. Zach Lowe, we talked a lot about some of his pieces. He did the league pass rankings. He did some other kind of preseason stuff over on both the podcast, the Lowe Post podcast at ESPN, which is great. And then also his X Factors story, which what he defines it as his 5 most intriguing players for the upcoming season. He says, we don't pick superstars or rookies. The goal is to find young-ish X Factors. And this is an insider piece by Zach Lowe at ESPN. It posted on Wednesday. So to give some sense, Ant is one of the players. Tyrese Halliburton of the Pacers now, of course, was traded there from Sacramento, is one of the other ones. DeAndre Hunter with the Hawks is another. Obi Toppin with the Knicks, which is a really interesting one in my opinion, and Patrick Williams of the Bulls are the other players mentioned. Anthony Edwards is interesting to me. I think it makes sense for him to be on this list. I think there is kind of this sense, some casual fans, some national folks think that Ant is already a star. He's not yet. He's on the cusp, right? And Lowe talks about that in this piece. He talks about well, here, I'll read a portion of it. He says, Edwards strutted into his first postseason as if the NBA's biggest stage had been waiting for him all along. He seized Minnesota's offense as Karl-Anthony Towns battled foul trouble, averaged 25 points, plus 40% shooting on 9.5 threes per game. He hypnotized defenders with crossovers and hesitation moves before rising above them or zooming through them. He hunted Ja Morant and tracked Morant on defense. He looked fearless and unfazed in a way only stars do. And then he goes on to talk about the nights where Edwards looked unstoppable throughout last season, which is 100% true. He also says Edwards has been a below average shooter from almost every spot on the floor. This is true. I talked about this on the show. At the rim, he's got to be better. 3-pointers, he's got to pick his spots because catch and shoot's great. The step back's really good in terms of step back threes, and it's a tough shot. The pull-up threes need to be better, and there probably need to be less of them. And he also should probably shoot less step back threes. He's so good at catch and shoot. Those other things have to be refined. He needs to be better in the paint. He needs to shoot less mid-range twos, although he did shoot less last year than he did as a rookie. Lowe goes on to say, like any young scorer, Edwards has struggled at times as a distributor, missing passing windows, holding the ball too long. The Wolves offense too often ground to a halt in Minnesota's first-round loss last season. Edwards ranked in the bottom half in efficiency among high-volume ball handlers in pick and rolls and isolations per second spectrum data. This is all true, and I've talked about this on the show. Now, it also was true of my favorite comp right now in terms of trajectory is Ja Morant. Look at Ja Morant's first 2 seasons. A lot of that's similar. Ja was always good at the rim, but Ja's a much worse jump shooter. He's not talking about defense here, but he's a much worse defender. Ant is bigger. Ant is stronger. He's a better shooter. He's as athletic as Ja Morant. Certainly. I mean, I think it's not a worthwhile argument to try and argue who's the more athletic player. How would we ever know? And if we want to talk defense, he's a better defender. The efficiency issues were really similar in year 2 for each of those guys, for both Ja and for Ant. If Ant can improve some of that, if he could just be better at the rim, and I'm saying this now after a 4 of 17 shooting performance on Wednesday, but he, even in the preseason, when he had those kind of like those 3 of 12, 4 of 15 nights, there were 1 or 2 layups where he just split the defense in a blink of an eye. Like if you're casually watching the game and you just like out of the corner of your eye, you see just a player streak to the basket. It's different, right? I'll use another football analogy. It's like the Cardinals were playing Thursday night football and Kyler Murray has the ball. It looks different than when almost any other quarterback except for Lamar Jackson runs the ball. Like as soon as they hit the line of scrimmage, it's just like shot out of a cannon. Ant's the same way, where all of a sudden he's at the basket and it just looks different than everyone else. And the Euro step looks better. He's finishing better with his left hand, I think, so far. Limited sample, of course, in preseason and 1 regular season game. But some of that stuff looks more comfortable, but the efficiency is not there because there's too many step backs. There's too many pull-up threes. There's a little too much still in the mid-range. There were 2 or 3 of those ill-advised kind of like break down the defense and shoot an 18-footer, which sometimes it's a relatively open one, but Ant uses so much clock and works so hard to get it. And then he's actually not that good of a mid-range shooter once he gets the shot up. And that's what Lowe is saying, is he struggled in all 3 phases, at the rim, mid-range, and beyond the arc. When it came to efficiency last season. And even when wide open, he's not a great mid-range shooter at this point. And maybe that changes. And some of those mid-range shots, like a mid-range shot can be a good one if you're Chris Paul or, prime Kobe Bryant, right? Like Kevin Garnett. Those guys all shot mid-range twos at a really high rate. But Ant's not there yet. Like, and I say that, I mean, that was a minor issue last year. He actually decreased the number of mid-range jumpers he shot in his second season versus his rookie season. But I think Lowe brings up some really great points, and it can be too easy to anoint somebody like Ant, who we want to do well and is an exciting player, is fun off the court. And the highlights are unreal. And when he does get hot, he's completely unstoppable. The arrogance in a good way, the healthy arrogance, I would say, that he possesses, all those things are great. I love that he wants to guard the opposing team's best ball handler, best perimeter player, but he's got to shore up the efficiency stuff offensively, the shot selection. I'm worried less about the distribution, about the passing, because I do think I don't know how much of Ant that Lowe watched last year, but that improved over the course of the season, leaps and bounds beyond where he was as a rookie. So I worry less about that. If the efficiency, the shot selection can improve, the defense stays where it's at, maybe improves incrementally, and finishing at the rim improves, then we're looking at an all-star. And I said this before the season. I do think he makes an all-star team this year. It's tough right now. As crazy as it is, through 5 preseason games and 1 regular season game, the tunnel vision thing here is, man, Ant's off to a rough start. It's 1 game. Preseason doesn't matter. Like, they'll figure it out. There hasn't been as much space with Rudy and Cat both around the paint. He'll get there. I'm confident he'll get there. But I bring this up because I think, first of all, it's a good read. So go read Zach Lowe's piece. He also talks about well, here, he actually mentions it. I forgot that he mentioned this in the piece. He talks about his step back threes. He shot the 6th most step back threes in the league of any player last season, but he shot 36% on them, which, I mean, that's a good percentage for step back threes. That's a tough shot. And yet he's good at them. He talks about how he needs to incorporate a little more post to his game. And then he talks about rebounding being an issue, which I've kind of really beat that up on this show quite a bit. So anyway, it's a good piece. Go read it. I'm not worried about Ant, of course, but I think it's important to mention that the national lens, there is somebody, in Zach Lowe who does a fantastic job that recognizes these things that Ant needs to improve. And I think it's important to underscore them. And especially in light of the game, the loss of the Thunder on Wednesday, those things are extra apparent now, I guess, more at the forefront than perhaps they were a couple weeks ago. All right, let's close with a quick Wolves Jazz preview. All right, the Timberwolves take on the Utah Jazz on Friday. The Jazz, I believe their preseason over-under was like 24.5. And I said this in my preseason, my Western Conference preview. I'm going to pull up where I actually had them. Shoot, that's right. I didn't actually put the so I think I had them 11th in the West because I do think they'll certainly be better than Oklahoma City and Houston and likely San Antonio. The wild card for me that they could still be better than is Portland. I had Portland 9 in the West and the Lakers 10. Oh no, wait. I had Sacramento. Yeah. And I had the Sacramento 11 and I had Utah 12. That's what it was. So they could be better than Sacramento. If Dame has injury issues again this season, then they could be better than Portland. And I think best case Utah could get all the way up to 11, maybe 10. That's an absolute best case. And I don't think anyone's picking them to finish 10th. But I guess what I'm trying to say is Utah's not the laughingstock that everyone assumed they would be when they traded away Donovan Mitchell, Rudy Gobert. They got back some useful NBA players. They beat the Nuggets on Wednesday by 21, which not a single person in the world would have thought that was going to happen. And it was a pretty easy win. They were up 22 at halftime. They won the game by 21. But I mean, listen, these are all rotation guys who have played minutes on playoff teams, right? Like not all of them, but all the guys I'm about to list: Kelly Olynyk, Lauri Markkanen, Mike Conley, Jared Vanderbilt, Jordan Clarkson, Rudy Gay, Malik Beasley. These are every single one of those guys has played playoff minutes on good teams. Now, none of them is a star. None of them is close to a star. Mike Conley at this stage is nowhere near where he was. He would be the closest thing at any point in his career to being a star. I guess Markkanen. So clearly there's a lack of high-end talent, but this team actually has depth with good players. I mean, their starting lineup was Conley, Clarkson, Olynyk, Markkanen, and Jared Vanderbilt. And their bench guys, Rudy Gay, Colin Sexton, Malik Beasley, Talen Horton-Tucker. That's a pretty good top 9. And then you have rookie Walker Kessler, rookie Timberwolves draft pick Walker Kessler, who had 12 and 10 in his debut, 5 of 5 from the field. That's a pretty good top 9. Again, no star power, and they're not going to be a 500 team, but could they win mid-20s games on accident? They've got a new coach that wants to prove himself, and as much as franchises may want to tank for Wembanyama, Danny Ainge does running the front office in Utah now. Their new coach would like to win. Those players want to win. Those guys all want to prove somebody wrong. So Utah may back into some wins early in the season before they start sitting guys, before guys come down with injuries, before guys are traded. there's a lot of pieces that they can trade at the deadline. I mean, you can't tell me teams aren't going to want Jared Vanderbilt. You can't tell me teams aren't going to want uh, even Jordan Clarkson. Everybody wants a shot in the arm to their bench. So I think I'm most intrigued by the Cat Vanderbilt matchup. I know that Vanderbilt's not technically their center. Well, I guess Karl-Anthony Towns isn't the Wolves center either. So the Vanderbilt Cat matchup is going to be a thing. I think Vando will be ultra aggressive. He fouled out on Wednesday in just 18 minutes. So, I mean, perhaps that's a thing. Perhaps Vando, revs the V8 engine a bit too much in his return to target center and gets into some foul trouble. That would be good for the Wolves. Because the depth in the front court isn't as good. They've got, Gay's effectively their backup 4 and Kessler's their backup 5, but that's kind of it. They don't have much other size. It's a big lineup, right? I mean, you're effectively starting Markkanen at the 3 with Vando and Olynyk in the front court. So, but that's kind of it. There's not much else in terms of size. So Gobert and Towns, if they can get any of those guys into foul trouble, the Wolves will be in good shape. Jordan Clarkson always seems to hurt the Wolves. I mean, he can hurt his team too. He had 6 turnovers to 5 assists in 30 minutes, only had 10 points on 9 shots in the win on Wednesday against Denver. But I just have a feeling that the Wolves will struggle with him. So I think the key is to get their front court into a little bit of foul trouble. It's limiting, making Clarkson take some of those crazy shots. Just kind of playing solid stay home defense. There's not a ton of shooting on this team besides Beasley. Sexton's hit and miss from deep. Clarkson is probably their next best shooter after Beasley. So it should be a win. The Wolves are favored. I think the betonline.net line is like 8.5 or 8 points. I said on Wednesday the Wolves were 10.5 point favorites. I said I wouldn't take the Wolves at minus 10.5, but I thought they'd win by multiple possessions. That happened. I kind of feel the same way about this one, although I don't hate the idea of them covering 8.5. It just feels like Utah's not going to win. I don't know. Wednesday was obviously fluky in some sense with Utah beating Denver by that much and the Wolves being that close to Oklahoma City. I'm not saying I would bet the Wolves minus 8.5, but I think we'll be in that realm. I think the Wolves will win by around, 8 to 10, 11 points, probably. It's not a terrible matchup for Minnesota because of the lack of front court depth, because of the relative lack of outside shooting, but it's also not as bad of a Utah team as folks may expect. I think this team will be competitive throughout much of the season. And that could make for a challenging game again on Friday. It would be a good challenge for the Wolves as they head into, I don't know. I mean, again, a pretty easy early part of the schedule, but they've really got to get it together against some of these teams before they take on the Phoenixes and others, as we talked about on the show. All right. Thanks again for watching, for listening to the show. We'll, of course, be live at the postcast with Marnie Gellner of Bally about 45 minutes following the Final Horn on Friday night's game. And then we'll be back on Monday, which will effectively be a post-game pod from Sunday's rematch against the Thunder in OKC. So that podcast will post probably late Sunday leading into Monday. That will serve as Monday's show. We'll do the live postcast again and the whole thing. We'll be doing that throughout the season. The plan is for every game. So make sure you're following and subscribe to Locked On Wolves wherever you listen to podcasts. That includes YouTube as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. You can also follow on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and my account, which is at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, CKEN. A reminder, the Locked On Sports Minnesota app can be found on Roku or Amazon Fire TV. Go ahead and download that and listen to all of your favorite Locked On Sports podcasts, Locked On Minnesota podcasts. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. The Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Thank you again for making us your first listen. You can make your second listen the Locked On NBA show. The NBA season is here, and our local NBA experts and insiders have you covered on and off the court all season long. All the biggest stories around the NBA every Monday through Friday in less than 30 minutes. Available on YouTube, Odyssey, and wherever you listen to podcasts. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.